He created the most iconic video game character of all time, and his games have sold over 1 billion copies all around the world. By 2006, he'd become so valuable to Nintendo that, for his own safety and the company's peace of mind, they told him he wasn't allowed to ride his bike to work anymore. In 2011, rumors of his retirement sent Nintendo's stock plummeting over $500 million in a single day. This is the story of how a child growing up in rural Japan became the most influential video game designer of all time. This is Shigeru Miyamoto. He was born November 16, 1952, in a small rural town called Sonobe in Kyoto Prefecture, Japan. His father was an English teacher at a local school, and on weekends, he took his family to the big city to watch Western films, especially Disney movies. Shigeru was a curious child, spending his days adventuring through the lush forests, mountains, and castle ruins surrounding his village. When he got home, he liked to watch puppet shows on television, like Hirokori Hayutenjima, and looking back as an adult, he even said that one of its characters, Don Gabancho, might have even influenced the creation of Mario. From a young age, Shigeru loved entertaining the people around him, and would stitch together handmade puppets and put on shows for his classmates. In middle school, he joined the basketball team, but after getting into a fight with one of his teammates, he quit to establish a manga club with his friends, which he continued until graduation. He dreamt of someday becoming a manga artist, and wrote letters to his favorite mangakas, like Shotaro Ishinomori, who'd created Kamen Rider and worked on manga like Astro Boy. In high school, Shigeru branched out and joined a music club, learning to play the guitar and developing a strong affection for the banjo. He loved music ever since his parents surprised him with a ukulele for Christmas as a kid. When he was older, he even built his own ukulele out of wood and yarn, but made it just a neck and no body, so he could practice late into the night without ever waking his family. In college, he joined a band and got into bluegrass, which he still plays to this very day. But Shigeru knew that not everybody could become a famous musician, so he ultimately chose a more pragmatic path with industrial design. He studied hard and got his degree, although he did have to repeat a year, much to his parents' disappointment. Shigeru didn't have a job lined up after graduating from Kanazawa College of Art in 1977, but one company in Kyoto did catch his eye while he was job hunting, a card and toy manufacturer called Nintendo. He submitted his application as an industrial designer, but Nintendo turned him down, saying they just weren't interested. But Shigeru refused to take no for an answer. His father had a mutual friend with Nintendo's then-president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and after some string pulling, Shigeru got a one-on-one interview with President Yamauchi. During the interview, he showed off some toys he'd made and left such a good impression on Yamauchi that he was hired as Nintendo's very first industrial designer. He later heard through the grapevine that President Yamauchi applied for a patent on one of the toys Shigeru brought into the interview and never told him. Miyamoto's earliest assignments were mostly designing packaging for Disney-themed board games and various other Nintendo products, but as luck would have it, he found himself in the exact right place at the exact right time. After his first year at Nintendo, Space Invaders took the world by storm, grossing nearly $4 billion and launching the then niche video game industry into a massive mainstream business. And Nintendo wanted a piece of the action. In 1979, Miyamoto was tasked with his first video game project, designing the exterior of the color TV game Block Kuzushi, containing 6 variations of the Atari game Breakout. The Block Kuzushi was one of Nintendo's earliest attempts at breaking into the then booming video game industry. Miyamoto also received his first software assignment, a game called Seesaw, which, despite its simplicity, he was never able to finish. Years later, Miyamoto reminisced about the unfinished game in Nintendo Official Magazine, explaining that Seesaw was actually the brainchild of Gunpei Yokoi, the man who created the Game Boy, who was both Miyamoto's boss as well as his mentor. He said, "Seesaw, that was Gunpei Yokoi's idea. He wanted a game where you bounce on the seesaw and bounce up off of it, but we couldn't figure out how to do it. It was really difficult. If you get on one end, the other end goes up. And if you hit one end real hard, the other end goes up just as hard. But we couldn't do it." Miyamoto just didn't yet have the skill to execute even this simple concept, although he later revisited the idea to create the lifts in Super Mario Bros. What was once impossible for him eventually became just a tiny slice of his 1985 masterpiece. The first game he ever completed was the 1979 arcade shooter Sheriff, where players controlled a gunslinger on a mission to rescue a woman captured by bandits. It was the first ever Nintendo game with a story centered around the damsel in distress idea, a theme that Miyamoto would later use as an archetype for games like Donkey Kong, Super Mario, and The Legend of Zelda. His next game was the top-down shooter Space Firebird, and then the much more successful Radar Scope. In a bid to capitalize on Radar Scope's success, Nintendo of America imported 3,000 arcade cabinets from Nintendo HQ, but the game wasn't nearly as popular in the US as it was in Japan. Nintendo of America only managed to sell about a third of their Radar Scope cabinets, leaving them with millions of dollars worth of unsold product. NOA's president, Minoru Arakawa, was in a panic and asked Yamauchi if there was some way he could convert all of those unsold Radar Scopes into a completely different game. Yamauchi agreed and saddled Yokoi and Miyamoto with the conversion project. Whatever this new game was gonna be, it had to run on the exact same hardware as Radar Scope, which forced the two designers to think within strict limitations, but outside the box. At the time, Nintendo was making Popeye products, like playing cards and even a Game & Watch, so Miyamoto decided to convert Radar Scope into a Popeye game. The premise was simple and reminiscent of Sheriff. The hero Popeye would rescue the damsel in distress, Olive Oyl, from her brutish kidnapper Bluto. Though the license fell through, so Miyamoto had to replace all the Popeye characters with brand new ones. So, Olive Oyl became Pauline, Bluto was swapped out for Donkey Kong, and Popeye was transformed into an Italian carpenter called Jumpman. Miyamoto devoted himself entirely to the conversion project, telling his friends they wouldn't see him for a few months until the job was done. He worked day and night, and even took baths at work, later recalling, "At the time, I was living in company-owned housing, just across the river from the office, so every day, I was just going back and forth between the office and the company housing. Thank goodness we had a company bathtub. There was also a water boiler that was used to make the Hanafuda playing cards, and the water from this boiler was also used for a bathtub. The employees making the Hanafuda could wash their sweat away in the bath after work, and at night, when nobody was around, you could hang out there for a long time. It totally saved me." Miyamoto and Yokoi originally planned for the screen to scroll like a cartoon, but those plans fell through when it became clear that Radar Scope's arcade boards were not capable of that. So they decided to make 4 separate screens, sort of like panels in a comic strip. Miyamoto initially wanted Donkey Kong to be played with only a joystick, but Radar Scope's cabinet had both a joystick and 1 button. It had to be used somehow, so they decided it may as well be used for jumping. A decision that went on to have a much bigger impact on the video game industry than they ever could have imagined. Development took 5 months. Then, after all of the Radar Scopes were manually converted, Donkey Kong quickly grew into a massive success. Not only did Nintendo of America manage to sell all 2,000 cabinets they were trying to get rid of, but they sold 60,000 more after that, raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. And that was just the first year alone. NOA president Arakawa's biggest problem transformed into his biggest asset. Then, he invested that huge pile of cash into 27 acres of land to expand Nintendo of America into the powerhouse that it is today. As Donkey Kong fever swept the globe, Miyamoto followed up with games like DK Jr., Donkey Kong 3, and Mario Bros. But none of them really managed to recapture the magic of the original. Mario Bros, for example, only sold 3,800 cabinets in the US, and as arcade sales continued to decline, Yamauchi began preparations for Nintendo's next chapter by introducing its first home console, the Famicom. He also established a brand new development team called Nintendo Research and Development 4, setting up Miyamoto as its chief producer. R&D 4 got to work crafting games for Famicom, placing a special emphasis on sports titles that they hoped would appeal to as wide an audience as possible. Miyamoto designed baseball, golf, and tennis all in time for the console's North American launch, where it was there renamed the Nintendo Entertainment System. Miyamoto was a game-making machine, pumping out as many as 8 games a year, including Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, Ice Climber, and as fate would have it, he finally got the chance to make a fully licensed Popeye game. One of the more notable titles was Devil World, which released in Japan and Europe, but famously became the only Miyamoto title that was never released in the US. Well, at least not until 2023, where it finally landed on Nintendo Switch Online. But back in the 80s, Nintendo of America had a policy against religious iconography, so a game where you're fighting the devil using Christian crosses and Bibles, that wasn't gonna fly. Devil World's most significant legacy, however, was that it was the first Miyamoto game made together with Takashi Tezuka, who quickly became one of Miyamoto's greatest assets. By the time Miyamoto finished his 20th game, he'd acquired not only the skill and experience, but just as importantly, he now had the team he needed to start a massive new project. A title that would change video games forever, and secured his place in the history books. We're talking Super Mario Bros. Miyamoto combined everything he'd learned since giving up on Seesaw. The slopes from Donkey Kong, the vines from DK Jr., the bigger characters of Devil World, and horizontal scrolling from Excitebike. Even though Super Mario Bros. Was an unprecedented undertaking, he simultaneously began work on a brand new IP at the same time, based on his adventures as a kid. While Mario was a linear game, Miyamoto wanted to build an open world, recreating the feeling of exploring his hometown village, like the Sonobe River, the Tenjin Mountain, and the ruins of Sonobe Castle. When Super Mario finally hit store shelves in '85, it was praised by critics and fans alike, eventually selling over 40 million copies. The Legend of Zelda launched a few months later, and it took the world by storm all over again, selling 1 million units on its first day and going on to sell many millions more. Miyamoto delivered 2 blockbusters back to back, and that catapulted Nintendo's first home console to the top of the sales charts and solidified himself as the world's most respected video game developer. He quickly rose to the ranks of Nintendo's corporate structure, which meant spending less time designing and more time supervising. His old friend from Devil World, Takashi Tezuka, took on the role of co-directing for Super Mario 2 and 3, and for Zelda 2, Miyamoto was much less hands-on, only serving as producer. By the time Nintendo started ramping up to release their next home console, the Super Famicom, Miyamoto had reached his late 30s and was starting to think about settling down. He struck up a relationship with a girl named Yasuko, who he eventually married and had a couple of kids with, a son and a daughter. While his personal life was maturing, so was his professional life. Nintendo reorganized his development team, R&D4, into a new team called EAD, Entertainment Analysis and Development. This new structure brought the development of hardware and software under one roof, with the strategic goal of creating synergies that could give Nintendo an advantage over their competitors, especially their Tokyo-based rival, Sega Corporation. Miyamoto's first task as head of EAD software was producing F-Zero as a Super Famicom launch title, which he quickly followed up with mega hits like Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Super Mario Kart. EAD teamed up with English developers Argonaut Software, the creators of the Super FX chip, to develop games like Star Fox that made the use of 3D polygons, with Miyamoto using his love of puppets, particularly the British show Thunderbirds, to come up with the game's characters and setting. These early 3D entries helped prepare Miyamoto and EAD for the next console generation. They even started working on a Mario 64 prototype as early as 1991. By now, Miyamoto had reached middle age, and fully conscious that he'd entered the back nine of his existence, he decided to take his personal health much more seriously. He quit playing pachinko, a sitting-styled arcade game similar to slot machines, and filled his newfound free time swimming at a local health club. He also quit smoking, but admitted to reporters that he'd accidentally traded one vice for another, as he'd caught himself eating way more sweets. He literally pointed at his gut to show them that the proof was in the pudding. The Nintendo 64 was Miyamoto's first time contributing to a console's creation, and his name even appears on several patents, including the N64 controller and memory pack. His biggest focus, however, was bringing the Big N's hugest franchises into the third dimension. At the same time, he was also producing his final Game Boy game, a little indie RPG called Pokemon Red and Green. In fact, it was Miyamoto's idea to split the game up into 2 versions to encourage trading between players, and it was also thanks to Miyamoto that the games ended up with 150 Pokemon, instead of only 30. Well, actually, 150 first got slipped in without him knowing about it, but that's a whole different story. Miyamoto had a lot of irons in the fire, but finishing Mario 64 in time for the N64's release date was his top priority. Unfortunately, though, he was spread so thin that he just couldn't meet the deadline. But President Yamauchi had so much faith in Miyamoto that he delayed the console's launch just for him, telling the press, "Game creators can finish games quickly if they compromise, but gamers have sharp eyes. They soon know if the games are compromised. Miyamoto asked for 2 more months, and I gave them to him unconditionally." Yamauchi's faith was well placed. When Mario 64 finally launched, it was met with critical and commercial success, becoming the N64's best-selling game of all time at 11 million copies sold. In 2021, a sealed copy sold at an auction for a blistering $1.5 million, a testament to the game's lasting legacy. Even if, there might have been some money laundering involved with that one, but Just like the NES era a decade prior, after revolutionizing the platformer genre with a brand new Mario, it was time to switch gears and breathe new life into the action-adventure genre with a brand new Zelda. Now, critics loved Mario 64, but there was one complaint that kept bubbling to the surface again and again: the camera. So initially, EAD considered making Link's Leap into 3D a first-person adventure that Miyamoto compared to GoldenEye. But one day his team went to a ninja show for inspiration, and they saw a samurai surrounded on all sides by enemies. Watching with amazement as the samurai switched focus to fight them one at a time, a light bulb went off in their heads, and they came up with a system that supplemented camera control they called Z-targeting. The first of its kind and a key component in what's been lauded as one of the greatest games of all time. There was also Star Fox 64, F-Zero X, and countless other hits. He oversaw some of the 90s most iconic titles, but unfortunately, the decade came to a close with some of his biggest misses. Nintendo originally announced the N64's disk drive add-on, the 64DD, would launch in late 1996, but after seemingly endless delays, it didn't release until late 1999. And it only managed to sell a humiliating 15,000 units. Miyamoto sank tons of time into games that never saw the light of day, like a breeding simulator called Cabbage. Cabbage was a collaborative effort with Satoru Iwata, Shigesato Itoi of the Mother series, and CEO of the Pokemon Company, Tsunekazu Ishihara. Players could raise a virtual pet on the 64DD, transfer it onto a Game Boy where it was kind of like a Tamagotchi, and then import it to the virtual world of a friend who had their own 64DD. Cabbage spent at least 4 years in development, and they even were planning on adding expansion content with additional discs. But unfortunately, it was abandoned after the disc drive's abysmal launch. Miyamoto also spent a lot of time producing the Mario Artist series, basically kid-friendly console Photoshop. IGN called it the 64DD's killer app, and said it was, quote, so easy to use that anyone could figure it out after a few minutes. Miyamoto had high hopes for Mario Artist, but half the series ended up getting cancelled before completion, and the half that did release only sold a few thousand copies. Making matters worse, Miyamoto was so focused on Mario Artist that he had to deprioritize Mario 128's development, the long-awaited sequel to Mario 64 that, just like Cabbage, never made it to market. With the 5th console generation coming to a close, industry belligerents started ramping up for the next console war, GameCube versus PlayStation 2. And Miyamoto had an ace up his sleeve, an aggressively original game that he was calling, quote, the next Mario. He'd taken unused elements from Mario 128 and produced what he believed would be the next big thing in video games. A revolution for the next generation, just as he'd delivered so many times before. Releasing a few weeks after the GameCube's launch, Pikmin was met with adoration from critics and fans alike. IGN gave it a 91, Game Informer a 93, and Nintendo Power gave it a perfect 100. But for some reason, people just weren't buying it. It barely scratched 1 million copies sold, and its sequel sold even less, despite earning even higher review scores. Simply put, the series was a flop by Miyamoto standards. Super Mario Sunshine suffered a similar fate too. It only sold half the numbers of its predecessor, and when the next Zelda game released a year later, it sold so poorly that its director, Eiji Aonuma, said it, quote, could mean the end of the franchise. The GameCube itself wasn't doing too hot either. It was getting outsold 7-1 by their rivals at Sony. The press began to wonder if Nintendo would succumb to the same fate Sega suffered a few years earlier, exiting the console business to focus exclusively on software. Financially, it was the darkest period in Nintendo's history since Miyamoto's rapid ascent 2 decades prior. But for Miyamoto and Nintendo both, it was darkest before the dawn. He was in his 50s now, and unlike his younger days, he wasn't just making games for children around the world. Now his own kids were old enough to play them, and he took a hard stance on how much they could play. He told his kids that the home consoles belonged to him. He owned them, and he'd only allow them to rent the consoles for a few hours at a time. Watching them play his games, and sometimes even letting them playtest his prototypes, he started to think about how he could appeal to less experienced gamers, and a wider audience in general. He told his friend Shigesato Itoi, "I want to make something where 80 to 90% of consumers can make it to the end, even if that means we have to risk that players who make it that far lose some of that feeling of challenge or achievement." Miyamoto was worried that modern games were only drawing in people who were already gamers, when what he really wanted to do was make gamers out of ordinary people. In other words, if Nintendo's slice of the gaming pie was getting smaller, then the pie itself needed to get a whole lot bigger. As Nintendo began working on their next console, the Wii, Miyamoto took charge of its revolutionary controller and played a key role in the pack-in title that eventually became Wii Sports. Now approaching 60, he was weighing himself daily, exercising, and making charts to track his performance. A routine he decided to make into a game called Wii Fit, which exploded in popularity with casuals and non-gamers, and it became a huge system seller. Nintendo released their new handheld, the DS, around the same time, so Miyamoto targeted casuals with another aspect of his personal life. He's actually a semi-professional dog breeder, and his family pet was a sheepdog named Piku. So he combined it with ideas from the long-abandoned Cabbage game to make Nintendogs, which went on to become the second best-selling DS game. The number 1 selling game, of course, was the new Super Mario Bros. Reboot. There was one Miyamoto hobby that didn't garner rave reviews and a giant pile of money, but we won't dwell on it. Both the DS and the Wii were incredibly successful at tapping into the casual market that Miyamoto was targeting, though he never forgot his core audience. The Wii's biggest launch title, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, garnered review scores of around 96% and more than doubled the sales of Wind Waker. It even managed to outsell Ocarina of Time, an achievement that possibly saved the series from extinction. Not to be outdone, Super Mario Galaxy burst onto the scene a year later with review scores of 97%, doubling Sunshine sales and stealing the crown from Mario 64. Miyamoto was back on top, but he had a lot more help this generation than he had previously. By now, he'd been promoted to senior managing director, more like a supervisor than a hands-on director. He became infamous for what his colleagues described as flipping the tea table. If he didn't like what he was seeing mid or even late development, he'd order his subordinates to completely rework major concepts, sometimes so drastically that games could get delayed a year or more. Miyamoto's table flipping instilled a lot of anxiety in his developers, but with sales records breaking left and right, it was hard to argue with the results. However, all good things must come to an end, and by the Wii era's closing, it seemed Miyamoto already had one foot in retirement. In 2011, he went on Japanese TV revealing he wasn't long from parting the industry, saying, "Honestly, I think seriously about what to do as I step away. When I want, I'm able to step back and pretend I'm not there, making sure not to butt in with my opinion, for instance. Although sometimes I can't help myself. I think the closer I get to 60, the easier it's been for me to pull away. Of course, I still have 5 years left." A month later, the then 59-year-old Miyamoto told Wired, "Inside our office, I've been recently declaring, I'm gonna retire. I'm not saying that I'm going to retire from game development altogether. What I mean by retiring is retiring from my current position." The next day, Nintendo stock plunged $500 million, prompting the company to release a statement saying, actually, Miyamoto wasn't going anywhere, and his role wasn't changing one iota either. But despite their assurances, it was clear to anybody paying attention that wasn't entirely true. His Mario co-director, Takashi Tezuka, had started a Mario Cram School to teach Nintendo's younger generation of developers how to make Mario games. And in the years that followed, Miyamoto continued to make no secret of the fact that he was passing the torch on both hardware and software as he phased himself out of the equation. His name still graced the credits of Mario 3D World, A Link Between Worlds, Star Fox Guard, and many more first-party games as a general producer, but he wasn't as intimately involved as he was in his younger days. In 2015, his title was changed to Fellow at Nintendo, and much of his attention turned to other projects, like a Super Mario movie, the Super Nintendo World theme park, and spending more time with his family, playing the guitar, and walking his dogs. Miyamoto celebrated his 71st birthday last year, and there's no question he's left a huge legacy since Donkey Kong. The Japanese government honored him with the Person of Cultural Merit Award, GDC gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award, and the French government made him a knight. He recently told The New Yorker, "It's taken about 10 years, but I feel that the younger generation here is now fully capable. We are moving toward a position that will ensure the spirit of Nintendo is passed down successfully. I'm not concerned about that anymore." We hope he's right, and whatever the future holds for you, Mr. Miyamoto, we wish you all the best. You have left a huge impact on Nintendo, the industry, and an entire generation of people that play video games, us included. Running around Bob-omb Battlefield, catching all 151 Pokemon, sailing the Great Sea. Your imagination defined our childhoods, and now that we're all grown up, it has defined our careers. So long, Miyamoto-san, and thanks for all the games. Did you also know that DidYouKnowGaming is making an actual game that tests your video game knowledge and that you can pre-order it right now? For more on that, check out the video on screen. And hi, my name is James. I hope my voiceover was okay. I hope it wasn't terrible. I have a YouTube channel called NitroRad where I review 3D platformers, sometimes horror games or weird indie games or I don't know, whatever I feel like. Special thanks to our translator Jacob and Sprite Cell for consultation. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.